All right. Why don't we start? Faye, you want to lead us in this opening prayer?
I don't have my glasses, but I'll try. Okay. We come to you today, O Lord, surrounded by the faith heroes of past and seeking to run our race of faith so that at the end you will say to us, well done, good and faithful servant. Be with us this day, lead us and teach us, so that today and each day hereafter we may become more like Jesus.
Thank you, Faye. Okay, we're going to strap on our seat belts and try to go through this material, but there's a lot. So I'm going to ask Ginger to start with chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, some of my favorite in the scripture.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Chapter 12.
Yep, verses 1 and 2. Well, you
Okay.
can go through 3, that first paragraph.
Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer, the perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart.
Thank you. I think that might say it all, and maybe I ought to just close it up and we ought to all go get a cup of coffee, doesn't it? It is just beautiful. I remember still, it was a Gator game we were watching on TV, and it was old Tim Tebow, and he always put reference to Bible verse in the black stuff under his eyes, and he had Hebrews 12:1, which seemed kind of appropriate for people playing in a stadium, because that's the picture that is here in this passage. Anyway, I think it's one of the most moving passages in the New Testament. The first verse is one long sentence, but it's worthy of noting, I think, that he goes from having been in the third person to the first person, and he talks about we now. He's putting himself into the picture, and this picture, of course, is athletes. Actually, they're running a long distance race here. This is not a sprint. This is more like a marathon, though I don't know that you run a marathon in a stadium, but why be picky about that? And he says we're surrounded by a crowd of witnesses. Remember, in the last chapter, he had a different picture. He's really good at using word pictures, which is the best way to learn, right? Stories and word pictures, because most of us are more visual in our learning. And last week he was talking about, it was almost like this great chain, one generation after another of faith heroes. And here he's turning it into a race, and they're passing the baton. Both of our girls ran track at Plant, and we saw what it took. Nancy, who ran the distances, she was in cross country, she would leave it all on the field. I remember one time she almost passed out at the end of the race, and we bundled her in the car to take her to the hospital, and we started plying her with Gatorade, and she came back. But that's the picture, I think, that so it's easy for me to visualize because I lived it as only a mama can, or daddy, but that's the picture that he's painting of these runners. All of them are, all the past heroes of the faith are sitting in that stadium cheering for us. It's kind of a nice, comforting thought, isn't it? And we want to make them proud. We want to come through it and be victorious, really. So this includes martyrs, and it includes all kinds of heroes of faith. And he says two things. He says, throw off everything that binds and put away the sin that so easily entangles. Basically, back in the day, first century runners would come into the stadium with these long flowing, colorful, beautiful robes, and then they'd throw all of that off to run, and they ran almost naked. But it was again a vivid picture. You come in with all the stuff, but it entangles. If you tried to run in a robe, you can think of it would be tough for Jesus to run in a robe when you think about him wearing what he wore. So the runners would throw off these robes, and even though the robes in themselves were not bad, they were something that would keep you from running the race. One of my commentators says, we're not talking about enduring patiently. And I'm thinking that that's like sitting through a long lecture. We're talking about a complete exertion of everything you have, a total struggle to get to the end. And the author says a big obstacle here is sin. Here he's not talking so much about moral temptation as he is talking about the sin that these people have been facing, which is to turn away from Jesus, the apostasy. But for a lot of us, sometimes the temptation is, do we really believe this? Are we better off just taking care of things ourselves? And he's saying, throw that thought as far away as you can, because God doesn't take sins lightly. And you think about David, and God did not let him get by with the twin sins of adultery and murder. Even though in those days, an Oriental potentate could kill anybody they wanted, it could have anybody they wanted. God says it doesn't matter what the world says. We have to live God's way. And of course, Moses couldn't get into the promised land because of a sin. I didn't know this because I'm not a Greek scholar, but according to one of my books, the word race is agona, and we get agony from that. I thought that was kind of interesting. So this race that he's talking about is a contest that requires the exertion of everything we've got, total commitment. In Revelation 2:10, the Smyrna church is being addressed, and it says, "Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life." The crown is a picture of the race again. So the next kind of thought on this is, how do you run? And he says, well, you run always with your eyes fixed on Jesus. A fast runner cannot be looking around, looking over their shoulder, because that just cuts their time. And so he's saying every day, every way, you keep your eyes focused on Jesus. And hopefully at the end of the day, you can say, I think I've moved closer to you today, Lord. It's good to listen to the testimony and the writings of those who have gone before us in the faith, but our eyes are supposed to be on Jesus. He ran the race and he set the perfect example of how to do it. It does say that that Jesus endured the cross. This is the only place in Hebrews where it talks about the cross. It's kind of interesting because Jesus has been held up for us the whole time, but this is the one place. And he scorned the shame. Crucifixion was a mixture of humiliation and torture. It was a double gotcha. Jesus stood totally alone at Gethsemane. He was abandoned at the trials. He was alone during his death. And he did it all to bring us into relationship with God. He's the supreme example of endurance. So he suggests that maybe we take a look at what terrible things we think we're going through and compare that with Jesus. Maybe that'll encourage us not to lose heart and get weary. I like this quote one of my books had. An Episcopal priest in New York City named Sam Shoemaker was asked why didn't he just run away from it all. His congregation was tough. The New York part where he lived was tough. And he responded, I'd like to, but a strange man on a cross won't let me. Thought that was a pretty good quote. Anyway, he uses the word in verse 3, consider Christ. The word there, consider, is used of calculations. It was kind of a mathematical term. It meant take account. So look at what Christ did. He's the example to help fight against sin. He talks about us fainting and growing weary. And that certainly does happen sometimes as we go through the Christian life. We sometimes just get tired. And Aristotle said, he described this fainting and growing weary as an athlete flinging themselves to the ground in a state of collapse as they go past the goalpost. And they're holding up that, we should just keep going for that goalpost. That's certainly what Nancy encountered on that fateful day that's still etched in my memory. But we see it when we watch the Olympics, right? They go through that, final post and they just kind of fall on the ground. And that's what this author is encouraging his readers and those of us who've read over the years to be like, to leave it all out on the field, as they say. So, and then he reminds them, but you haven't yet shed blood for Christ. And that may well apply to all of us. I don't know everybody's history, but we certainly live in a more accepting times of Christianity, at least in this country, at least superficially in this country. Anyway, he then kind of turns his focus and he turns to Proverbs 3:11 and 12, the Greek translation. And he talks about the difficulties in our life. Now, he's not talking about the difficulties we create when we mess up, but he talks about the difficulties that we sometimes see in our life. And he says, kind of taking advice Solomon gave to his son, that this is God loving us with parental discipline. Our parents smacked our hands or used strong words or whatever to get us to grow up so that we didn't eat with our hands and so that we did all the things that we needed to do to grow up, appropriately and hopefully as good people. And he says, God does the same thing. And so when we see God's discipline, we should welcome it, even though it's not fun. In the Old Testament, God rebuked David. David decided he was going to take a census. Now, why do rulers take a census? Well, usually two reasons. One is to get a list of the people that would be subject to conscription for military services. And the other is the favorite, taxes. So they needed to know who all the people were so they could get to them. But God had told David, don't take a census, just rely on me to take care of your needs for money and protection, people who will take care of you. And so when David took this census, God called him on the carpet and he gave him a choice of 3 different punishments he could have. And David said, I'm leaving it to you. And so God sent a plague that killed 70,000 people. Whoa, that's a little rough. I don't know that I really believe that God punishes people by hurting other people, but anyway, it is a story that tells us that God does not take these things lightly, and he disciplines. His discipline shows his love of his children, and that's how we should view some of the hardship that we go through. The fourth century biblical scholar Jerome, Jerome wrote the Vulgate, or translated the Vulgate, which for many, many, many centuries was the Roman Catholic authorized Bible. This is what he said. The supreme punishment is God leaving a person alone as unteachable, as all God's discipline comes from his love and is intended for good. So he's saying, if God leaves you alone, it's because you probably decided you want to be left alone by God. And then, here you are, you're on your own, which isn't the greatest place to be in this eternity. This is not an attempt in this section, including the David thing I just mentioned. It's not an attempt to account for all pain in the world, but he is trying to make some sense to the readers of the struggle they're facing in the faith, where people are not accepting him, they're threatening to throw him out of the synagogue and all of that. He's saying that discipline confirms that you are not illegitimate children of God. He loves you and you're his own. Former Dallas head coach Tom Landry is quoted as saying, "The job of a coach is to make men do what they don't want to do in order that they may be what they always wanted to be." I think that may be applicable also to God's working with us along the way. So God doesn't make mistakes. He aims to make each of us perfect at the end of the day. In the passage, God is spoken of as the Father of our spirits, which is probably the opposite of the Greek talking about Father of our flesh. Nobody likes punishment, but at the end, we should achieve a harvest of righteousness and peace. So another place he calls it, enable us to reach the Christian goals of peace, shalom, and holiness. So let me quickly say here that the Jewish thought of peace is not a negative concept. Here we think of peace as no war. With them, or freedom from troubles. I'm at peace. I don't have anything bugging me right now. He sees peace, shalom peace, as positive. It's something that brings a person the greatest good. It is not an absence of something. It's a positive something, being with God and being at peace with your fellow humans. That's not always easy to accomplish. You can't just sit back on your hands and let God, do a little thing and give you peace. Peace comes with really communion with Christ, who is what? The Prince of Peace. So the other thing is holiness. Holiness is kind of the other side of the peace coin. It's part of the sanctification process as we go forward with Christ. So he kind of turns a corner at verse 12, and he says, therefore, and he asks them to strengthen their feeble arms and weak knees. Gee, he must be talking to people like me, old people that don't get enough exercise. As we run to God's throne of grace and make the path level, don't be a stumbling block. Isaiah in chapter 35, verses 3 and 4, also call for people to strengthen their weak hands and make their feet firm, their feeble knees, and speak to the fearful hearted, be strong. So this is a continuation from the Old Testament counseling. And he said that the way that we react to people or should react or respond to people who are having trouble is to encourage them. The strong should encourage the weak. We have a job in this also, to help the weak, the people who are going through troubles, come through it with Christ. Be the person that mediates and holds hands between that person and Jesus. And then in verses 14 through 17, and because of the amount of material, I'm not going to read every one of these. He's beginning to admonish the congregation what to do. And he says, pursue peace with all people and holiness before God. A double duty we all know we have. What are the two commandments Jesus said? Love your neighbor and love God. This is another way to do it. Pursue peace with other people. Peace isn't always going to happen because some people just not going to accept you. But you should pursue that. In love, you should pursue peace with everybody else, and certainly love God. The next thing he says is there's some dangers in that threaten Christians. One is missing out on God's grace, letting lethargy, procrastination, or thoughtlessness, all things that I do pretty easily, cause a person to miss the chance for grace. We have to avoid the indifference of Cain, who said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" We need to grow strong, helping one another and being with Christ. He tells his people, root out poisonous, bitter fruit, corrupting influences. Just don't get close to them. Get away from them. And then he talks about sexual immorality, Greek word pornos. Wonder where we got our words. He's also talking about with spiritual sexual immorality. He's probably also talking about spiritual unfaithfulness in this and godlessness. An unhallowed life here is the one of the words used, babelos, which is the kind of person who doesn't recognize anything higher than the earth. There's nothing sacred to them. There are people that we've met that are like that, right? They hold nothing sacred. And he holds up as the example of that, the great Jewish non-hero Esau. In Jewish tradition and literature outside of the Bible, Esau's badness grew way beyond what the scripture says. He became this symbol of everything that was bad: immoral, godless, short-sighted, self-indulgent, defiled in body and spirit, a totally sensual man. Some said he was sexually immoral, but the Bible doesn't say that. Philo, who was a Jewish Alexandrian philosopher, said that, well, he went and married 2 Hittite women. And then when his parents were unhappy about that, who did he marry? The daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's other son. So he drew from that Esau was immoral. But the bottom line is that Esau didn't have any regard for God's promises and blessings, and he sold his inheritance for a bowl of stew. Are we looking for instant gratification, for good times right here, and not worrying about the long run of the race? Esau made a choice, and he had to live with his consequences, even though when it finally dawned on him, he went to his dad with tears in his eyes and said, "Help me." And Dad said, "There's nothing I can do, son. You made your choice." So now we're going to go, he takes on a whole new different picture. One of the things this author we've figured out has done a lot is he's compared the old covenant and the new covenant. And now he's going to compare Mount Sinai, which is where Moses got the law, with Mount Zion. And we're not talking about the southeast quarter of Jerusalem. He's talking about the heavenly Mount Zion, where God is and where Jesus now sits at his right hand, right? And he says, in the passage, I'm going to commend you to look at verses 18 through 21. The passage is very vivid, because when the Israelites got to Mount, when they got there, they pointed out, he talks about that the mountain was burning with fire, darkness, gloom, and storm. There's a trumpet blast, or a voice speaking words. It was so scary that the people begged that nothing else be spoken. They said, "God, don't talk to us. We're scared." They couldn't bear it. The law said that if anyone or anything, animal or person, touched Mount Sinai, they had to be stoned to death. It also provided that they could be shot with arrows, but hey, that's no better, really. So that the people were so terrifying that that they said to Moses, "We're trembling with fear." And they told Moses, "You go up and talk to God. We don't need to talk to him in person. He's too scary." And on the other side of the coin, he talks about Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. And he talks about what is there. Mount Sinai was totally unapproachable by any living creature. The first law giving, the Lord spoke to Jesus or to the people out of the fire, but it was a God who was in lonely majesty, completely separated from mankind and provoking overwhelming fear. The author emphasized his distance, his transcendence, and God's judgment. So Mount Sinai, the law, became fearsome and horrifying. And Israel was not supposed to stay on Mount Sinai. And what he's saying is that the law, not all of the law, the parts that related to the temple, the Levitical priesthood, the sacrificial system, they were temporary. They were hoping maybe to scare people into righteousness. But and Moses was the mediator, but he could never bridge the gap between God and man. So then when we got to 22, I kind of jumped the gun. I told Will I'd do this because he's not a big fan of Robert Frost, but this reminds me of the picture, Robert Frost paints with his two roads diverged in a yellow wood. You can take Mount Sinai or you can take Mount Zion. And if you go there, if you take Mount Zion, there's no fear, there's no overwhelming, unloving God. Instead, you have a God who is approachable and loving. You have a whole bunch, myriads of angels. There's no gloom. There's no kind of threat. Zion's courts, the only verdict is not guilty. Why? Because Jesus has already paid for our sins. And so you go and you can have direct access to God. The author talks about the church of the firstborn, the heirs of the promise. We're destined to be among the cloud of witnesses for the generations to come, our kids and grandkids and their kids and grandkids. It's called the communion of saints. Isn't that what we call it? The non-Jewish firstborn in Egypt were killed. Esau was a firstborn and he despised his birthright. But believers are the firstborn of Christ and he makes us holy. And so the implicit message to his readers was, don't despise your birthright in Jesus. We can come to God, the judge of all persons, and Jesus, the mediator of the covenant. The judge awaits in glory, but fear for believers is gone. All remains. We still have a magnificent God. So he calls the people that are there, the spirits of righteous men made perfect, even though they started out as sinners, right? He talks about their names being written in heaven. How about that? Our names written in heaven? It includes all the New Testament believers, the Old Testament saints, enrolled in the heavenly city. Back then, enrolled kind of meant two things depending on who you're talking to. The Jewish people believed, many of them, that God had a book of life, and everybody that was, on God's side was written in there. You always kind of wanted to know where your name was. Roman citizens had a little different thing. Basically, every time a person had a legitimate child, the dad would go to the city offices within 30 days of the birth and enroll that child, and they would be listed as a Roman citizen forever. So the readers would know about this tradition. So when he says your names are enrolled in heaven, they would think about this law for Romans, that you could have this high honor of being a Roman citizen. Well, this is a higher honor, right? We can be a citizen of the city of heaven based on the blood of Jesus. There's blood in both places, Sinai, He really reaches into to Moses, who started the sacrificial system, and all it could do was cover up sins. It could not forgive sins. And of course, you have Jesus' blood, which actually frees us and forgives us of sins. So he talks about that we, with the sprinkled blood of Christ, should be obedient. Christ is obedient to death, brought about our fulfillment. He's the fulfillment of all the sacrificial ritual in the Old Testament, and the new covenant depends on Christ's death and resurrection. Salvation is sure, the gulf's been bridged. So I am going to, oh, so then he moves to another picture. He's hopping around, isn't he? And he's driving me crazy a little bit. But the next hop is he talks about at the end, God is going to shake, and he says earth and heaven. We always say heaven and earth. I almost said it again. But in verses 25 through 29, he talks about God is going to shake earth and heaven, relying on Haggai the prophet 2:6. When the law was given, as we read a little bit, the Mount Sinai, there was a shaking, an earthquake when Jesus died, right? There's an earthquake. And the expectation is when Jesus comes back, earth and heaven will be shaken. And at that point, everything that is not eternal will be shaken loose. And only that which is tied to God for Jesus will remain. In the new covenant, believers will remain. We'll get past the shaking. So he, in chapter 12, sees Christian worship as the fulfillment of the laws relating to the Levitical tabernacle, the sacrificial system. Believers are now you have the priesthood of all believers serving as priests in the heavenly Jerusalem. And that is a permanent, eternal situation. Galloping right along to chapter 13, and I'm going to only have time to hit the high spots. Essentially, his sermon's over at the end of 12, and he's just going to get to some practical admonitions in 13. First and foremost, he tells people to love each other. You know, Jesus said they'll know you're Christians by your love. And that was indeed one of the things that people in the community, outside community, noted about Christians is how much they loved one another and took care of each other. He ties to that the ancient Jewish virtue of hospitality. Love each other and give hospitality. And then he tells them to care for prisoners. Back in those days, they didn't really provide prisoners food or medicine or clothing, and they were dependent on family and friends from the outside. And sometimes you had to bribe the guards to get access to them. But Christian prisoners, to the credit of the early Christians, were not neglected. And it became very well known. A fellow named Tertullian, a Roman, who in his piece, The Apology, said those sent to mines or banished to the islands or shut up in prisons for nothing more than their fidelity to Christ became nurslings of their confession, meaning other Christians took care of these people who were sent away. An Athenian orator named Aristides said of Christians, if they hear that any of their members is imprisoned or in distress for the sake of their Christ's name, they render aid in his necessity, and if he can be redeemed, they set him free. The apostolic confession required that money be set aside to redeem and ransom saints who were slaves, captives, and prisoners. There's a report that a group of Numidian raiders carried away Christians at the Church of Carthage, which redeemed all of them. They took up enough money to free these prisoners from the Numidian robbers. Christians even sold themselves as slaves to ransom their Christian friends. You know, we are a Matthew 25 congregation, and among those things that Matthew 25 talks about is visiting prisoners. We do have an obligation to care for those, and particularly those of our brothers and sisters who are in dire circumstances. Not surprisingly, he says the two great impediments to Christian life are sex and money. That a person can be destroyed by loving the wrong person or the wrong thing. Christians should be content with what they have. And in the early days, the life, the wholesome and pure life of Christians was a testimony to those around them. A Roman, Pliny the Younger, who was governor of Bithynia, wrote to Emperor Trajan. He said he was looking for a charge against the Christians, but he learned that at their Lord's Day meetings, they pledged to avoid theft, robbery, and adultery, never to break their word or to repudiate a deposit when called on, and to refund it. He couldn't find anything to charge with Christians with being bad about. That's pretty spectacular. We've got a pretty good example out there. The love of money here is not so much talking about greed as talking about the fear of abandonment. We're afraid that if we don't have enough money in our 401k, we're not going to make it. You know, we're not going to have the kind of life that we hope to have all the way to the end. And there's a place where it gets to where we're not relying on the Lord any longer. Yes, we need to be smart about money, but we don't need to start to rely on our savings account instead of the Lord. We should trust God and remain true to the confession. He also commends the people to pray for their earthly leaders and to listen to them. It may be that the author of Hebrews himself was in prison somewhere. And then he gets into some pretty obscure reasoning, but this is the situation I think they're in. A bunch of these readers, the people in the congregation, may have been either thrown out, excommunicated from the synagogue, or threatened with it. And so he says that basically, in most cases, he reminds them, in most cases, when you sacrificed an animal under the Jewish tradition, the priest got a bit of the animal for their own food. That's how they got paid. But on the Day of Atonement, we went through that a little bit, when the animal was sacrificed and the blood was put on the altar of incense and the mercy seat, the animal would then be burned, but nobody could eat it. They had to take the remains outside the community, outside the city, outside the camp in the wilderness days. Jesus was crucified outside the city. And so he said, he was implying, don't be worried about being put out of the synagogue, because you have some good examples, both in the Old and in the New, of when something is sanctified. Jesus sacrificed, the animals sacrificed, then they were put outside the camp also. So we have, he ties up no home in an earthly city. Ultimately, our home is the heavenly Jerusalem. And now I can't move my pages, so what can I say? I'm gonna do a little bit of a summary. We're gonna go over we're gonna say the doxology that is in chapter 13 as our final benediction, but some concluding thoughts on Hebrews, and I'll let y'all talk. It's pretty much, and I'm sure you feel this by now, this book is pretty much unique in the New Testament. It emphasizes Jesus as the great high priest, a role that we don't see for him anyplace else. And he bases that on Melchizedek in Psalm 110:4. What's Jesus' priesthood like? Well, it's eternal and it's backed with God by an oath. He parallels the high priest's work on the Day of Atonement and Christ's atoning work. Jesus was the fulfillment as the once for all sacrifice, and Jesus didn't have to sacrifice for his own sins because he was sinless. There's a unique emphasis on the new covenant as the fulfillment of the old one. It all comes to fulfillment in Jesus. And Hebrews has some of the highest Christology in the entire Bible. Jesus is the creator at the beginning. He sits at God's right hand. He's the author and perfecter of faith. He's going to be with God in the end. He's fully human and fully divine. The story of Israel and of Jesus become one long. We have the Old Testament heroes of the faith coming right up to today, holding hands with Jesus as the anchor, or watching from the stadium as we run the race of life. So Hebrews is a different way to understand Jesus as the source of eternal salvation. So I'm going to quit until we get to the doxology that's in Hebrews 13, which will be our benediction today. What have you enjoyed, hated, loved, worried about in Hebrews?
Marcia,
Yes.
first, a word of commendation. I really appreciate the depth of your scholarship, and Hebrews is a book I've somewhat avoided as a whole, choosing parts that were easier. So I appreciate that discipline. A thought that occurred to me this morning, and I'll say this briefly, and I don't want to say it too strongly, and a framework that I operate out of is my passion for the book of James, that works, faith without works is dead. And so that tends to shape what I hear and see. You know, in the book of Romans, first 11 chapters are in a sense all about grace, and chapter 12 is therefore, and then the practical application and how we're to live our faith. And it strikes me that the first 11 chapters of Hebrew, and again, I don't want to say this too strongly, perhaps could be understood as the emphasis on grace. You know, Christ is the final sacrifice, the high priest, your direct access to God. And then, as you pointed out today, it's the therefore. We talk as Protestants, one of our principles is the perseverance of the saints. And some people characterize that as once saved, always saved, meaning you will, but perseverance in Hebrews is about our effort, our running the race. And I particularly liked in Tom Long's commentary, and I know you use that commentary, that this race is not the Olympics. It's more like the Special Olympics, that all of us are running with difficulty. And he also says it's more like being at the back of the pack in a marathon than at the start. So again, I heard for myself a reinforcement of, yes, we are saved by grace, and therefore we need to persevere. We need to continue to seek to live guided by the Spirit of Christ. But again, thank you, Marcia.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I liked also that reference to being at the back of the pack and having some of the people help those of us that aren't such good runners. And I thought about, I think this year didn't we have Olympics this year? Whenever we last had Olympics, and somebody fell down, and I think it was in the Special Olympics. And the gal who happened to be in the women's part, and the gal who was running next to her stopped, helped her, and they kind of hobbled off all the way to the end. And that's a picture of what I think was happening here. Yeah, Bill, thank you for that. Okay, others?
It's Faye. I think, first of all, ditto what, I mean, you're a fabulous instructor and appreciate your research and depth, etc. But I was moved by the extreme things people were doing to stay pure, like to castrate themselves
Yeah, that was
and
Origin.
stuff like that. I mean, it almost feels culty
Well, there
versus
was, yeah,
spiritual.
early on,
It
I would say,
it weirded me out.
yeah, I would say Origin was a not your typical, but there were people who were so certain, and of course they pick on certain words within Paul, but who were so sure Jesus was coming back right now that they didn't get married. They just were waiting on Jesus. And in fact, some of the early preachers had to tell people, get on with life, because, Jesus wants you to be active out there. Like Bill's saying, helping people, doing things, don't just, but Origen may have had a little kink in his psyche. I don't know, but his father was martyred when he was young, and he always wanted to be a martyr like his dad. We all want to be like somebody, but that was extreme. And so it said he went and walked with people who were going to their executions, and I think he kept hoping somebody would pick him. And he was not martyred. Ultimately, he was tortured for the faith, and he died from the torture, but that was a ways down the road. And in the meantime, he was really taking it to extremes. I don't know anybody that would suggest that today.
Yeah, I agree. I also thought that these examples of early Christians and the level of suffering that they put up with, and what a chicken I am. I told you, I'd be in Europe, and if you want me to be Catholic, I'll be Catholic. You want me to be Protestant, I'll be Protestant. I believe in the same God. You don't need to kill me over this, right?
Right.
But this level of suffering, and as you mentioned earlier, that our biggest thing is, do we still just believe, versus the fact that we'd have to be tortured. And I don't know. My goodness, what a journey they had.
They did. Yeah.
I have to say a word for Origin. He didn't castrate himself. That's
But
like
that
a
was-
rumor
I
Eusebius
was gonna
started.
say, that is true. That is a legend. You don't know that he didn't. Any more than
I don't
you know
think
that he
anyone
did.
really believes he did. It was a legend started by Eusebius, and it was kind of to
Right.
undercut Origin's theology.
Well, they didn't agree with one another, but I don't know. It's pretty clear he was wanting to be a martyr, like his dad. Anyway, others?
Before we go to church.
Marcia, I wanted to ask you, after reading all of this, because I think one of the things I was thinking about as we studied this class is that the interpretation of the Jewish cultic system and seeing Christ's death through that prism leads to a kind of substitutionary atonement. And I wondered what your thoughts were on how you see the death of Christ, the crucifixion of Christ through Hebrews, and if it's changed any through reading this, or do you see it the same way? Because I think it's a very unique way of seeing the kind of salvific work of Christ's death, and it's been very strong in Christian theology. I would say it's kind of outsized in a way. As far as, like you were saying, the book's kind of something we keep on the side, and yet this vision of what Christ's death means, I would say, is outsized compared to how many people actually read the book.
Well, I think that you have to figure out the context in which he's writing. And he's talking to people who are used to the idea of something like substitutionary atonement. He's pointing out that the sacrifice of animals, isn't ever going to completely fix things for you. So he's writing in that context, because that's where, any good teacher or writer starts with where people are coming from. And they're looking at, well, you have to have blood. There's no forgiveness of sins without blood. And so I think he's trying to show that there, if you required blood, the only blood that's really satisfactory is the once for all, for everybody, the sinless Christ. But he also, I think, talks heavily about reconciliation, and his ultimate goal here. I think I've said before that for this author, I think that his definition of religion is access to God, being able to be with God. And he talks about that the goal of all of this is that Jesus has given us access Moses was not able to give us, because he didn't open the door. So in the end, he is talking about a reconciliatory kind of a thing. But I think a lot of the substitutionary it was so ingrained in their way of thinking.
To follow up on that, do you think he's speaking about that in a literal sense or more metaphorical? Because the way I
About
read
that,
it,
what's the substitutionary?
Oh, just the idea of this sacrifice for the atonement of sins. I tend to think he's using that as this very metaphorical framework to understand Christ, and I think it's become kind of literalized.
Well, that's true for a lot of stuff in the Bible, where there's a statement in the, well, like, Paul, it's better not to marry. And then whether Origen castrated himself or whether he just, there were a lot of people that chose not to marry and have families because they thought Jesus was coming right back. I think people have kind of literalized some things. So it could really well be metaphorical, but as I say, he was starting with things like there's no salvation without blood, or no forgiveness without blood, where his people's mindset was and what they were threatening to go back to. And so, he spoke the language they spoke or understood.
Yeah.
But it won't be the first or last. It's just like using this book or any other statement to support slavery or, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic or whatever. I think that's taking stuff and using it for your own purpose. Anybody else got something they want to throw in on all of this? I do love the race, maybe because our girls both competed in track, but I love that analogy, and obviously Mr. Tebow did too. Well, if we're done, I don't want to cut anybody off, but I think that folks are pretty much done, and I'm pretty much done. So if you'll put up the benediction, this is out of chapter 13. I didn't write down which verses it was. But anyway, this is the benediction that's
20 through 21.
Okay, that's right. I did write it in somewhere. Anyways, this is a benediction in chapter 13 of Hebrews. Rob, why don't you lead us in that one?
Okay. Now may the God of peace, who through the blood of the eternal, am I on?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Who through the blood of the eternal covenant brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus, that great shepherd of the sheep, equipped you with everything good for doing his will. And may he work in us what is pleasing to him, through Jesus Christ, to whom the glory forever and ever. Amen.
All righty. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia.
Y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia.
Have a good
Thank you,
week.
Marcia.
See ya.
Take care. Thank y'all.
Thank you.